So if we rewind a bit, specifically back to the mid-1980s, there was this highly unusual educational project funded by the United States government.
Right. Yeah. Through USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Exactly. They basically funneled, it was $51 million to the University of Nebraska, Omaha. And, normally you'd think, okay, USAID, maybe they're building bridges or funding agricultural research, maybe medical relief.
Sure. Standard humanitarian aid stuff.
Right. But no, the objective here was to print primary school math textbooks, specifically for Afghan refugee children who, they had been displaced by the Soviet invasion at the time.
And we are talking about millions of these books. Over 13 million copies were printed in Dari and Pashto and then distributed throughout all these refugee camps and madrasas across the region.
Yeah, but here is where it gets incredibly dark. Because these were not your standard, elementary school math books. Like, if you open one up, a child wasn't being asked to add 2 apples and 3 apples.
No, not at all.
They were explicitly being asked to learn mathematics using the imagery of war. So they were taught to count using illustrations of dead Soviet soldiers, or tanks, or, landmines and Kalashnikov rifles.
Which is just, it's wild to even think about.
It is. And the curriculum, it wasn't a mistake. It was meticulously designed by these foreign policy strategists specifically to stoke militant anti-Soviet sentiment in kids who were, quite frankly, barely old enough to tie their own shoes.
Yeah, and this wasn't some covert conspiracy theory that got declassified decades later. It was entirely documented. It was open policy. The systemic goal there was to cultivate an entire generation of proxy warriors.
Right.
People who would view this massive geopolitical superpower conflict as a sacred religious duty.
Yeah.
They were basically weaponizing a theological concept specifically, the concept of a holy struggle.
Just stripping it entirely of its ethical parameters.
Yeah, exactly. Stripping it of all its spiritual meaning and literally reprogramming it just to serve the secular foreign policy interests of a nation state that was sitting, thousands of miles away.
Which, when you really sit with that image, just picture policymakers in a comfortable boardroom in Nebraska engineering this curriculum of violence for traumatized refugee children just to win a proxy war. You have to ask yourself, how does human society get to a point where this is just considered normal statecraft?
Yeah, how does a system justify treating human lives, especially children, as completely expendable cogs in a political machine?
Right. And that right there, that forces a diagnostic question, which is exactly why we're opening today's deep dive with that specific, incredibly dark piece of history.
Because it forces us to look past all the surface-level symptoms of global chaos, right? It makes us look at the actual structural architecture of how human beings organize themselves, how we perceive authority, and, how we even define morality in the first place.
Exactly. And so today we are unpacking a really fascinating stack of sources that attempt to answer that exact diagnostic question. We're going to be looking at a collection of theological blueprints, systemic audits, and historical documents that all basically revolve around one massive theme, which is the systemic structural blueprint for human morality and governance.
And I think it's really crucial to establish right up front that these documents, they don't treat morality as some kind of subjective floating philosophical idea.
No, they don't.
They approach human rights, societal structure, global justice, all of it, as a matter of rigorous, almost mathematical engineering. They basically argue that there is a precise physics to human morality, just like there's a precise physics to thermodynamics or gravity.
Yeah. Now, before we really pull this engine apart, I do want to lay down some ground rules for our conversation today, because as you're listening to this, you are going to hear some incredibly potent structural critiques of modern political systems, secular frameworks, nation states, and even, honestly, the concept of modern democracy itself.
Yeah, the source material pulls absolutely no punches.
Not at all. But as always, our job here in this deep dive is not to tell you who to vote for or what religion to follow or what political ideology to adopt. We are putting on our structural engineering hats today.
Right. We're remaining completely impartial.
Exactly. We are just going to map out the mechanics of the arguments presented in these texts, test their internal logic, and see what we can learn from the architecture they're proposing.
So we kind of have to agree to suspend our immediate defensive biases for an hour. Because to really grasp the argument these documents are making, you have to Well, you have to temporarily step entirely outside of the modern secular paradigm.
You have to look at the world through a very specific unified lens that the sources establish literally on page 1.
Right, and there is a strict, non-negotiable instruction in our source material regarding this exact lens. The texts argue that the natural order of the physical universe and the divine moral code, they're not two separate things. They're one integrated, unified reality.
Yes, and we need to be very clear about this for everyone listening. Whenever we refer to this unified operating system today, we are instructed by the text to use its complete combined name, which is Deen-e-Haq, Deen-e-Islam. We cannot shorten it.
It's an incredibly deliberate phrasing, and I think we should break that down because it really is the foundation of everything we're about to discuss.
Let's do it.
So, Fitrat refers to the absolute, unchangeable nature of the universe. It's the way things are inherently built.
Whoa.
Gravity is part of Fitrat. The fact that water boils at a specific temperature, that's Fitrat, is this natural law that always moves toward unity and equilibrium. And then Islam, in this specific context, represents the intentional code of submission to the creator of that nature.
So the argument they're making is that Deen-e-Haq, Deen-e-Islam isn't just a private spiritual belief system you practice on the weekends.
No, not at all.
It's presented as an undeniable structural reality. It's the argument that a society must actively align its legal and moral codes with the actual physical laws of the universe, or it will inevitably just tear itself apart.
Precisely. Because if you build a bridge that ignores the laws of gravity, well, the bridge is going to collapse. So the sources argue that if you build a society that ignores the inherent natural laws of human morality and this divine code, that society will also collapse into tyranny and exploitation.
Like printing math books that teach children to count dead bodies.
Exactly like that.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we are going to understand how this massive global operating system is actually supposed to work, where do we even begin? Because looking at the entire global political architecture all at once is just overwhelming.
It is, but the documents actually tell us to start at the absolute smallest, most microscopic level possible.
Oh.
Before you can build a just society, you have to understand the fundamental unit of power that drives human action in the first place. You have to start inside the human heart, specifically with the concept of pure intention.
Right, Naya.
Naya, the intentionality behind an action.
I really want to spend some time on this because our sources draw a massive bright red line between how the modern secular world views humanitarian work and how Deen-e-Haq, Deen-e-Islam views it.
Oh, it's a completely different paradigm.
It really is. So let's say you're listening to this and you decide to donate $1,000 to build a well in a developing country. In a secular framework, why did you do it?
Right.
Maybe you did it out of secular humanism. You just feel a biological sense of empathy. Maybe you did it for national pride. Or let's just be completely cynical but honest here. Maybe you did it to get a tax write-off.
Or to get your name on a plaque.
Exactly. Or to post about it on social media so your peers see you as a good person.
And in the secular framework, the outcome is almost always prioritized over the origin of the intention. As long as the well gets built and people get water, the system doesn't particularly care if your motivation was rooted in total vanity.
Right. But the sources argue that in the framework of Deen-e-Haq, Deen-e-Islam, that secular motivation is structurally flawed. Like, from an engineering perspective, it's broken. It argues that serving humanity must be driven strictly by something called al-hubban lillah.
Al-hubban lillah.
Loving.
For the sake of Allah. The texts root this very heavily in Quranic verse 2.165. The core argument here is that the real objective, the only valid structural motivation behind any humanitarian deed, has to be the love for the Creator and the pursuit of success in the hereafter.
Okay, wait, I need to push back on this a little bit.
Yeah.
Because to a modern ear, that almost sounds, I don't know, selfish. Or maybe dismissive of just basic human empathy.
I see how it sounds that way, yeah.
Because are the sources honestly saying that just wanting to help a neighbor because it feels good to be kind or because you naturally feel bad for them isn't enough? Isn't human empathy inherently a good thing? Like, why does the anchor of the intention matter so much if the neighbor still gets helped in the end?
That is the exact friction point the texts want us to examine. It is not that human empathy is bad. It is that human empathy is fundamentally fragile. It is a biological and emotional battery that eventually will just die.
Oh, because it's reliant on external validation or just our internal emotional states at any given moment?
Exactly. Let's play out your hypothetical with a neighbor. You help your neighbor purely out of a subjective feeling of empathy. But what happens when that neighbor is deeply ungrateful?
Right.
What happens when they actually insult you? Or what happens if you try to help a community and that community turns corrupt, or the media stops covering their plight and you just no longer get that dopamine hit of feeling like a savior?
Your motivation collapses. You get burnout. You just say, fine, I'm done helping them. They don't deserve it.
Right. Because your anchor was temporary. It was shifting. You were relying on an emotional battery that ran out of juice.
Yeah.
But if your intention, your niyyah, is anchored to al-hubban lillah, loving for the sake of an ever-living, unchanging creator, your motivation becomes as eternal as the creator himself.
Wow. Okay, that makes sense.
You aren't doing it for the thank you. You aren't doing it for the plaque. You aren't even doing it just because you feel a fleeting sense of pity. You are doing it because it is the structural, non-negotiable requirement of your relationship with the divine.
So systemically, you're plugging into an eternal power grid rather than a disposable battery. It removes the ego entirely from the act of charity. Like, if I am helping you solely for the sake of the creator, I don't need you to be grateful to me. My transaction isn't actually with you at all. My transaction is with the creator.
That's beautifully put. And the sources point to Surah Al-Anbiya, verse 107, to show what this looks like when it is perfectly executed in reality. It speaks of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, being sent as Rahmatan lil Alamin.
A mercy to the worlds.
A mercy to the world, plural. The text emphasizes that showing proactive mercy to creation isn't just a pleasant philosophical idea.
Yeah.
It's not just a hobby for nice people. It is the direct, physical manifestation of the real Sunnah, the prophetic tradition. It is the operational execution of Deen-e-Fitrat, Deen-e-Islam at the individual level. So if you claim to follow this operating system, you literally must be a proactive agent of mercy.
I am really glad you emphasized the word worlds, because the scope of this mercy is staggering when you dig into the sources. We have this profound hadith, a prophetic tradition from al-Baihaqi that's highlighted in our source stack. And I really want you listening to chew on the wording here. It says, quote, "All creatures are like a family of Allah, and he loves the most those who are kindest to his family." All creatures.
Yeah, that completely shatters the modern tribal parameters of what we consider service.
Right, because normally in our society, our empathy is strictly bounded by our in-group. We care about our family first, then maybe our town, then our nation. And our political systems, they actively encourage this way of thinking.
Oh, absolutely.
They tell us that the people living inside our imaginary borders matter, and the people living 10 feet outside those borders are at best a secondary concern, and at worst, collateral damage in a conflict. But this divine family concept obliterates that boundary entirely. It extends the mandate of mercy to all of humanity.
And it doesn't even stop at humanity.
No.
The text is explicit. It extends to the animal kingdom. It extends the environment to the earth itself. Every single living thing is part of this cosmic family.
So, practically speaking, what does that actually mean? If I'm an individual trying to operate within Deen-e-Fitrat, Deen-e-Islam, how does my treatment of, say, an animal or a river dictate my standing with the creator?
Well, it means that if a massive corporation dumps toxic waste into a river just to save money on manufacturing, that is not just an environmental policy failure.
Right.
It is an act of spiritual violence. It is a direct attack on the family of the creator. If a society factory farms animals with immense cruelty just for cheaper meat, that is a structural violation of the core operating system. The core argument here is that your relationship with the creator is entirely proportionally dependent on how you treat his creation. You simply cannot claim to love the creator while actively abusing his family.
Which brings us to a really intense part of this diagnostic manual, because we're moving from why we must show mercy, the intention, to the actual cosmic mechanics of what happens when we do it, or more terrifyingly, what happens when we don't.
Yeah.
Because the sources, they treat this like a strict, unbending law of physics.
They absolutely do. It is presented as a strict proportional law. We see the formula laid out very clearly in Jami at Tirmidhi 1924. The prophet says, "The merciful are shown mercy by Ar-Rahman. Be merciful on the earth, and you will be shown mercy from who is above the heavens."
It's as if mercy is the ultimate currency of the cosmos. But the catch is, you can only receive it if you are actively spending it here on earth.
Exactly. You can't hoard it.
Right. You have to distribute it to the divine family in order to have it credited back to your account by the creator.
That is the exact systemic flow of this operating system. The input has to match the desired output. And the sources attach a very stark, very severe warning to this equation. Sahih Bukhari, 70,376 states, Allah will not be merciful to those who are not merciful to mankind.
Wait, full stop. Will not be merciful. There's no loophole there.
No loophole. None. It is a binary structural reality. If you block the flow of mercy to creation, you block the flow of divine mercy to yourself. Period.
But I mean, doesn't that contradict a lot of how people typically view religious salvation? A lot of people think, look, I pray 5 times a day, I fast, I go to the mosque, I read scripture. Sure, I'm a ruthless landlord who exploits my tenants and I'm mean to my employees, but my personal rituals are perfect, so I'm good, right?
And the sources address that exact hypocrisy head on. They reference another crucial hadith, which is Bukhari 6099, and it outlines a theological rule that radically levels human arrogance. It basically states that personal deeds alone, I don't care how many prayers you say or how much you fast, are structurally insufficient for entry into Jannah, into paradise, without Allah's mercy.
The text mentions that the companions of the Prophet were genuinely shocked by this when he told them. They actually pushed back and asked him, "Not even you, O Messenger of Allah."
Right. And his response is really the cornerstone of this entire framework. He replied, "Not even I, unless Allah covers me in his mercy."
That is just wild to me. The man considered the most perfect human being to ever live admits that his own resume of good deeds is mathematically insufficient to buy his way into heaven.
Because heaven is infinite and human deeds are inherently finite.
Yeah.
You cannot buy the infinite with the finite. The only bridge between the two is divine mercy.
Okay, let me make sure I'm tracing this logic perfectly, because this is really the fulcrum of the whole argument. The text says, Step 1, no human being can enter paradise without receiving Allah's mercy.
Correct.
Step 2, Allah explicitly states, He will not grant His mercy to those who withhold mercy from creation. Therefore, Step 3, showing proactive physical mercy to creation, to the divine family, is the non-negotiable prerequisite to salvation. It isn't a bonus, it isn't extra credit for the overly pious, it is the absolute baseline. If you aren't actively operating as a mechanism of mercy on earth, your personal rituals are effectively voided.
You've mapped it perfectly. The entire spiritual framework of Deen-e Fitrat, Deen-e Islam, pivots entirely on this axis of active empathy. If the internal software of your heart isn't generating mercy, the external hardware of your rituals is just meaningless.
But that creates a massive, almost terrifying logistical problem. It's one thing for me to make sure I am personally nice to my neighbor. I can control that. I can make sure I leave water out for a stray cat. But if this standard of absolute proactive mercy is the baseline for human existence, how on earth do you skip that?
That's the big question.
Yeah, like how do you build an entire society, an entire state around a mandate that strict?
You are asking the exact question the sources pivot to next. Scaling this mercy requires transitioning from individual ethics to universal human rights and global political architecture. And again, the texts demand we look at the stark contrast between the boundless scope of Islamic mercy and the inherently limited scope of secular borders.
Right. The sources point to the farewell sermon of the Prophet as well as Quranic verses like 49.13 and 4.1. And they use these to establish the absolute unshakable baseline of human equality, which is a single origin, Adam.
Right, because every human being originates from the exact same source, created by the exact same creator. Everyone is fundamentally equal. It's a biological and spiritual constant.
Which flies completely in the face of how the modern world organizes itself. The secular world loves to draw arbitrary lines on a map. They establish a nation-state and say, okay, human rights, dignity, and wealth apply to our citizens within this specific border. But the people living 10 feet across that imaginary line, they are a different nation. If they starve, it's not our problem. If we need their resources, they're collateral damage.
Deen-e Fitrat, Deen-e Islam fundamentally rejects that division, right?
It rejects it because nature itself rejects it. Fitrat always goes toward unity. Think about it. A virus doesn't respect a border. Carbon emissions don't stop at a checkpoint.
Exactly.
The systemic manifestation of this universal mercy at the societal level is a Quranic concept the sources refer to as Deen-e-Haq.
Deen-e-Haq, which means the system of social justice.
Yes. And the standard of care demanded by Deen-e-Haq is breathtakingly high. The benchmark, quote, used in the text attributed to the governance of early Islamic leaders like Umar ibn al-Khattab is that under this system, quote, even a dog should not die of thirst. Even a dog should not die of thirst. I just want everyone listening to stop and think about the sheer staggering logistics required to make that a reality across an entire empire or a modern nation. To guarantee that not a single human being goes hungry is difficult enough, but to ensure that the infrastructure is so robust, so perfectly managed, that even stray animals are protected from deprivation. That requires more than just good intentions.
Oh, absolutely. It requires immense technical competence.
Yeah.
You simply cannot run a society purely on prayers and good wishes. You need physical infrastructure. And this is exactly where the sources introduce a vital concept: acquired knowledge.
Acquired knowledge. Break that down for us.
Acquired knowledge is essentially the hardware of human civilization. It is the science, the engineering, the statecraft, the administration, the technology. You can have the purest intention in your heart, the software of Al-Hubanlillah.
Right.
But if you don't possess the acquired knowledge to actually build an aqueduct, you cannot physically deliver water to the thirsty dog.
Oh.
You need engineers to build roads. You need economists to manage a treasury without corruption. You need administrators to distribute resources fairly.
Okay, I have to pause here because our source documents have a very strict mandatory instruction for this specific part of the discussion. There is a clarification section regarding a quote from the famous philosopher and poet, Dr. Muhammad Iqbal. And we have to get this distinction exactly right because it is so easy to misunderstand.
It is a critical nuance, yes.
So Dr. Iqbal famously observed, and I'm quoting from the text here, "The inner core of the present Western civilization is purely Quranic." Now, if I am just a casual listener and I hear that completely out of context, my brain immediately thinks, wait, is he saying Western secularism is Islamic? Is he saying modern Western democracy is exactly what the Quran wants? But the sources aggressively clarify that he is absolutely not saying that.
Not at all. Dr. Iqbal's observation refers exclusively to the Western mastery of structural scientific discipline. He is talking about their total mastery of acquired knowledge, the hardware.
He is looking at the scientific method, the organizational efficiency, the technological advancements, the ability to harness thermodynamics, gravity, and chemistry to build incredible infrastructure. And he is saying the physical laws of nature they are harnessing are inherently Quranic because Allah created those physical laws. That's fitrat.
Exactly. The West observed the natural universe, understood its rules, and used them to build highly efficient technical structures. However, the mandatory distinction the sources force us to make is this. This mastery of acquired knowledge must never be conflated with the universal Quranic concept of Deen-e-Haq, the revealed system of social justice.
Because acquired knowledge, the hardware, is inherently morally neutral.
Precisely. Let's use an analogy. An airplane is an incredible feat of acquired knowledge. It perfectly utilizes the laws of aerodynamics. But the airplane itself doesn't have a conscience.
Right.
You can use that airplane to drop emergency food supplies to a starving village, executing the mercy of Deen-e-Haq, or you can use that exact same airplane to drop white phosphorus on a civilian population, executing a secular imperialist agenda.
So the outcome depends entirely on the ideological compass that is steering the hardware.
That is the crux of the entire systemic audit. The argument is that the modern West built brilliant, unprecedented hardware through acquired knowledge, but they directed it with a secular, profit-driven, border-obsessed ideology. Deen-e-Fitrat, Deen Islam, demands that this brilliant hardware must be directed by the divine compass of Deen-e-Haq. The tools of science and statecraft must be explicitly harnessed to ensure the thirsty dog is cared for rather than exploited for profit.
But this brings us to the most massive, glaring question of this entire deep dive. It is the elephant in the room. If Deen-e-Fitrat, Deen Islam provides this flawless, mathematically sound blueprint for human rights, and if humanity currently possesses the acquired knowledge, the technology, and resources to actually feed everyone and fix the planet, well, why is the modern world so incredibly chaotic?
Yeah.
Why is there so much war, extreme poverty, and division? If we have the blueprint and we have the tools, why is the house on fire?
The sources don't mince words here. They argue that the chaos is not an accident. It is not a glitch in the system. It is the result of a massive systemic hijack, a deliberate structural deception that has fundamentally rewired how human beings perceive reality, authority, and morality. And to really understand how this hijack works, we have to examine the mechanics of a concept that is usually deeply misunderstood, which is worship.
The framework of ibadah. Now, if you ask the average person on the street what worship means, they are going to describe a private spiritual feeling. They'll say it means going to a church or a mosque or a temple. It means singing hymns, praying on a mat, lighting a candle. It's confined to a building in a weekend. But our sources define worship as a complete, comprehensive, systemic body.
The text breaks ibadah down into two essential, inseparable pillars. Think of it like a human being. The physical body represents atat, which translates to total obedience. It is the physical action, the legal compliance, the scale of what you do with your life and your resources.
And then the soul, or the lifeblood of that body, represents muhabbaha, intense love. It is the deepest motivation, the ultimate loyalty behind the action.
So true worship, and the framework of Dini Fitrat Dini Islam, means giving your total obedience, your atat, to the Creator, driven by an intense love, your muhabbaha, for the Creator.
And here is the crucial zero-tolerance rule the texts establish. If your obedience or your intense love for anything else, your wealth, your family, your career, or your nation, equals or supersedes your love and obedience to Allah, that is the exact definition of shirk.
Shirk, association, idolatry. It is placing a partner alongside the Creator or replacing Him entirely.
And this is where the diagnostic X-ray of these documents produces its most provocative image. The sources argue that the modern secular world, the world that prides itself on being rational, scientific, and post-religion, hasn't actually eliminated religion at all. It hasn't eliminated idolatry. It has simply replaced it with a massive, invisible, systemic form of shirk. The texts refer to it as Deen-e-Secularism.
Deen-e-Secularism, the one-eyed religion of the godless world. And the audit maps this out mechanically. They argue that the secular state replaces the Creator with a new, man-made, mechanical trinity.
Let's walk through the gears of this mechanical trinity carefully, because it fundamentally redefines how we view global politics. Gear 1. The Creator, the ultimate sovereign, is replaced by the country or the state. The state becomes the new God.
Think about it systemically. The state demands your ultimate loyalty. It demands a portion of your wealth through taxes, just as religion demands tithes or zakat. It demands that you sacrifice your life for it in times of war. It dictates what is legally right and wrong. It occupies the exact structural space of a deity.
But a state is just an abstract concept. It's imaginary lines drawn on a map by old men centuries ago. Human beings are physical creatures. We struggle to direct our muhabbaha, or intense love, toward an abstract concept. We need something tangible. We need a symbol. Which brings us to gear 2 of the Trinity.
The state flag. The text explicitly refers to this as the country-state flag god idol. It is the physical, non-living symbol that replaces the ever-living Creator.
Now, I know some listeners might bristle at this, thinking, come on, it's just a flag, it's just patriotism, nobody actually worships a flag. But look at the behavior. You are taught to stand and salute it. You pledge your ultimate allegiance to it. You sing anthems to it. When soldiers die in combat, what do? We drape their caskets in it, turning it into a sacred burial shroud. It absolutely functions as a sacred object of veneration.
It does. But here is the structural flaw. A flag is just a piece of fabric. It is an idol. And like all idols, it cannot speak. It cannot think. It cannot draft legislation. It requires a priesthood to speak on its behalf. Which brings us to gear 3 of the Trinity, the mouthpiece.
The Quranic term for this mouthpiece is Taghut. In the modern secular system, the texts argue this Taghut takes the form of the politicians, the parliaments, and the concept of democracy itself, the idea of the divine rights of people. Because the flag is silent, the politicians act as the physical voice of the idol, passing man-made laws in the name of the state.
We must pass this law for the good of the nation. The nation is the silent God. The politician is the Taghut speaking for it.
I really want to dig our heels in here because the sources present a philosophical and mathematical argument against this democratic system that completely blew my mind. They call the delegation paradox. And if you are listening to this, I want you to really test this logic in your own mind.
It is a devastating piece of internal logic. Let's trace it.
Okay, so the text argues that democracy inherently defies the laws of nature through a simple math problem regarding authority. Let's say I, as an individual citizen, look at the law of gravity. I have exactly zero authority to invent a law that overrides gravity. I can't vote gravity out of existence.
Obviously. You don't have the jurisdiction over Fitrat.
Right. Now, extending that to morality, I also have zero inherent objective authority to invent moral realities that go against the natural order. For example, I cannot personally declare that exploitation or riba, usury and infinite debt or dropping bombs on civilians is morally good. I possess zero absolute authority.
You are a mathematical zero in terms of ultimate sovereign authority.
So here is the paradox. If I have zero authority to legalize exploitation, and my neighbor has zero authority, and the guy down the street has zero authority, if 1 million of us group together and hold a vote, 0 plus 0 plus 0, 1 million times over, is still mathematically zero.
You cannot delegate a power you do not own.
Exactly. If we as individuals do not possess the divine right to alter the fundamental laws of nature and morality, we cannot magically manufacture that right out of thin air simply by electing a politician, putting them in a fancy building, and calling it a mandate. A collection of mathematical zeros cannot create structural authority.
So how do they get away with it? How does the secular system convince billions of rational, educated people that this mathematical zero is actually an absolute, unquestionable authority? The sources call this psychological manipulation the highest magic.
The highest magic. It sounds like fantasy, but they are talking about mass psychological conditioning.
It is the systemic separation of wisdom from the soul. The text notes that in a secular world, citizens are conditioned from birth to take oaths to idle wind, abstract concepts like the state, and pledge their allegiance to a piece of fabric rather than the ever-living creator.
This magic trick effectively neuters true religion. It turns faith into a mere private sect. It says, sure, you can have your religion, but keep it in your house or your mosque on the weekends. But when it comes to the public sphere, the economy, the military, the legal system, the state is God.
And the result of this highest magic is that human beings shut down their critical thinking. They adopt what the sources call a cult posture. They become completely willing to sacrifice their lives and the lives of others for imaginary borders and pieces of fabric, entirely forgetting the universal divine family we talked about at the beginning.
Right.
They cheer for wars that slaughter innocent people as long as it benefits their specific flag idol.
Which brings us perfectly back to the horror story we opened the show with. Because it is one thing to sit here and talk about Taghut and the mechanical trinity in abstract theoretical terms. It's another thing entirely to see this highest magic weaponized in the real world, leaving a trail of actual bodies.
The Afghan textbook case. This is the prime historical audit the sources use to prove that these man-made structures manipulate humanity for the benefit of a predator elite.
Let's look at this case study through the lens of everything we've just discussed. We have the University of Nebraska-Omaha, funded by USAID, spending $51 million to print math books that teach Afghan refugee children to count dead Russians.
This is a flawless example of acquired knowledge, the hardware of educational curriculum, logistics, printing presses, and distribution networks being entirely directed by a destructive secular ideology.
But look at how they did it. Connect the dots for us systemically. How does this illustrate the concept of the Taghut and the idol?
Think back to our very first point today. In Deen-e-Fitra Deen-e-Islam, the intention, the niyya, must be al-hubban lillah, pure love for Allah, manifesting as proactive mercy to the divine family.
Right.
Now look at what the secular state did with the Afghan textbooks. The state, acting as the false god, hijacked a profound theological concept, jihad.
A concept that historically and textually is deeply bound by ethical rules of engagement, intention, and justice.
Exactly. But the secular state entirely stripped it of its spiritual parameters, its mercy, and its divine intention. They completely hollowed it out, and they stuffed it with their own secular geopolitical agenda. They turned a spiritual concept into a psychological weapon to fight a proxy war against a rival superpower, the Soviet Union.
They used the vocabulary of faith to serve the interests of the flag idol.
Yes. The secular predator elite looked at vulnerable, traumatized refugee children and didn't see humans deserving of Deen-e-Haq. They saw expendable cogs, they saw cheap ammunition for their machine, they engineered violence through acquired knowledge.
And that proves the central thesis of the audit. When the state operates outside of Deen-e-Fitra Deen-e-Islam, it acts exactly like an ancient pagan false god. It literally demands human sacrifice in this case, the minds and bodies of children, for its own survival and geopolitical dominance. It is entirely divorced from the natural law of unity and mercy. It was a predatory system.
It is a profoundly destructive shadow.
That is incredibly heavy to process. And if you are listening, you might be feeling a bit of existential dread right now, because if the system is this rigged, if the highest magic is this pervasive, how do we ever fix it? But this brings us to the absolute crescendo of today's deep dive. The sources do not just leave us with a diagnosis of a terminal disease, they actually provide the cure. The texts outline what they call the closing instructions.
The structural solution, how to dismantle the shadow.
And to dismantle it, you have to understand the rigid mechanics of how it was built in the first place. The text lays out the mechanical sequence of false authority, like a series of interlocking gears. We've mentioned them, but let's really lock them together now. Gear 1, the country, state, flag, god, idol. This physical symbol anchors the illusion. Gear 2, the Taghut mouthpiece, the politicians who speak for the idol. Gear 3, the fake man-made law that they produce laws that legalize things like riba, infinite debt, or proxy wars.
And the sources reference Surah Al-Kahf, verse 26, to explain why these gears are necessary. The verse states that Allah does not let anyone share in his command. His laws, fitrat, are the unchangeable constants of the universe.
They are unamendable, just like gravity.
Exactly. You cannot bypass gravity naturally. Therefore, if human beings, specifically a predator elite, want to pass a law that goes against nature, like an economic system based on usury that mathematically guarantees the rich get richer while the poor starve for it, they have massive structural problems. They don't have the natural authority to do it.
The delegation paradox, 0 plus 0 is 0.
Right. So, because they lack natural authority, they must invent a counterfeit authority. They must invent the flag idol and the Taghut to artificially authorize this non-natural legislation. The ultimate empirical proof.
The empirical proof.
They don't just want you to believe this theory. They offer a 360-degree litmus test that grounds all of this in observable, undeniable reality.
Right. If you are listening to this and you are still wondering, is this mechanical breakdown of secularism really true? Are flags really idols? Is democracy really a mathematical illusion?
The sources issue a universal challenge. Let's call it the riba challenge.
The challenge is simple. Try to implement riba, an interest-based economy, which we know violates the natural constant of efficiency and justice as the operational law of the land, without relying on the authority of a country-state flag god idol. I want you to really think about this. Try to pass a law that says it is perfectly legal for a bank to charge 25% interest and foreclose on a family's home, but do it without a constitution, without a parliament, and without claiming you are doing it for the nation.
Mechanically, the text argues it is an absolute structural impossibility, because the text of the Quran, the unchangeable constant, cannot be amended or rewritten by human hands. You cannot simply say interest is now lawful under a law. The absolute law forbids it.
So what do you have to do?
Therefore, to implement a law that violates the natural constant, you must, out of pure mechanical necessity, construct a highly specific bypass system. You must have the artificial framework, the state, the idol, the Taghut, to validate and normalize the violation.
The inability to execute a false law independently of this artificial framework proves that the alternative divine framework is the absolute truth. You literally cannot commit the crime without wearing the mask.
I want to spend significant time on this because it is the intellectual peak of the entire deep dive.
The discussion here culminates in what the texts call the absolute fact of nature. The premise is this: Allah's laws cannot be replaced without the invention of a false god.
And they back this up using a specific verse, Surah Fusilat, verse 41.53, which says, "We will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth."
Right.
The texts use this verse as an empirical laboratory proof, dividing it into two dimensions: horizons, which they translate as external mechanics, and selves, which they translate as internal logic. Let's break this down meticulously, starting with the external mechanics, the horizons.
The external proof uses a brilliant analogy regarding physics. Think about how a shadow works. A shadow cannot manifest in the physical world on its own. It is an absence of light. Therefore, a shadow absolutely requires a physical object to block the light source.
Wait, let me make sure I follow the mapping of this analogy.
Yeah.
The light is natural law, Deen-e Fitrat, Deen Islam.
Yes.
What is the shadow?
The shadow is the fake law, a law against nature, like the legalization of riba or the division of humanity through borders. Just as a shadow needs an object to exist, a fake law cannot manifest legally or structurally without an anchor blocking the truth. Passing fake laws against nature requires anchoring a physical country-state flag god idol.
Oh, I see.
You need the physical idol, the flag, the state apparatus to cast the legal shadow. Without the physical object blocking the light, the shadow vanishes instantly.
That makes perfect sense mechanically. You can't have the fake law without the fake idol to authorize it. Now, what about the internal logic, the selves? How does this manifest psychologically inside the human mind?
This connects directly back to the delegation paradox we spent so much time on earlier, because an individual inherently knows they have zero right to legislate against nature. They know they cannot change the speed of light or the moral reality of theft. They know they cannot delegate that right to a politician. 0 plus 0 equals 0.
Right.
So internally, psychologically, humans are forced to invent a fiction to cope with their rebellion.
It's cognitive dissonance on a species-wide level. We know we aren't gods. We know we don't have the authority to alter the fitrat. So we build a false god, the abstract state, and we pretend it has the sovereign authority, and then we pretend it gave us the authority through democracy.
Exactly. You have to invest fake sovereign authority into an inanimate state idol to bypass your own internal psychological knowledge that you lack the right to change the laws of the universe. The internal self requires the illusion just as much as the external horizon requires the shadow.
And this leads to the ultimate verification, the empirical proof that brings everything together. The documents state that this sequence, the country-state flag god idol, leading to the Taghut mouthpiece, leading to the fake law, is a rigid mechanical law of cause and effect.
It is as mechanical as a gear turning another gear.
So here is the explosive conclusion of the text, and I want to make sure I state this clearly. The sources argue that we can run a structural experiment.
A thought experiment, really.
Yeah. If you mechanically subtract the country-state flag god idol, which you achieve via that mathematical separation of the Constitution we talked about, splitting it into part 1 and part 2, isolating the divine law from the administrative law, the entire counterfeit legislative sequence instantly collapses.
It shatters. Remove the anchor and the shadow disappears. Remove the idol and the Taghut loses its voice. It can no longer claim divine jurisdiction. And if the Taghut loses its voice, the fake laws, the riba, the systemic exploitation, the predator elite's wish list lose their imaginary jurisdiction over human life.
And the proof.
Because it is physically, mathematically, and structurally impossible to pass a false law without first inventing a false god to authorize it, this inevitable collapse provides undeniable, empirical, observable proof.
Proof of what?
Proof that Allah exists and that the Quran is the absolute truth, or HAQ. It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the natural order, Fitra, Deen-e Islam, is the only mathematically and structurally sound operating system for human reality. Anything else mathematically equals zero. Anything else requires a manufactured, idolatrous delusion to sustain itself.
That completely flips the script on how we view modern society.
Yeah.
It's not that religion is a myth hiding in a scientific world. It's that the secular state is a myth hiding in a divine reality.
It demands a total, uncomfortable reevaluation of structural reality.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought experiment drawn from the deeper layers of these sources. We haven't mentioned this yet, but it's the absolute perfect way to cap off this architectural audit. They call it the universal retrieval test, or the burning of books.
I love this one.
Imagine that tomorrow, some catastrophic event occurs, and every single written text, every digital archive, every server, every legal code, every record on oath is burned to ashes. A total wipe. Everything is gone.
Complete erasure.
The sources argue that if this happened, only 3 realities would be universally retrievable from the canvas of existence because they are hard-coded into reality itself.
And what are they?
First, the Quran, because it's preserved perfectly, word for word, within the human memory of millions of people across the globe. Second, statecraft, because the natural law of unity, organization, and administrative logistics would inherently, naturally rebuild itself out of necessity. And third, science, because the physical forces of the universe, gravity, thermodynamics, mathematics, remain completely unchangeable.
But the secular constitution, the invisible borders, the country-state flag god idol.
They would vaporize permanently. They would be completely unretrievable because they were never real to begin with. They were nothing but a manufactured myth held together by collective imagination and predator elites.
It's a profound thought experiment. When the artificial structures burn away, only the fitrat remains.
Think about that the next time you look at the skyline, or the borders on a map, or the structures governing our world. Look closely at the blueprints. Question the foundation. I want to thank you for joining us on this incredibly intense deep dive. It's been quite a journey.
Thank you for taking the time to explore this with us. Keep questioning and stay curious.